There is a name that has outlived an empire. Long after the crowns were melted down, the borders redrawn, and the palaces turned into museums for tourists to walk through in silence, the surnames remained. Habsburger, von Trapp, Auer, Steiner, Gruber. Names that families in the Alps and along the Danube have carried for centuries, believing they knew exactly what those names meant. Austrian blood, imperial roots, a lineage tied cleanly to the court that once ruled half of Europe. Then the DNA arrived. And the story of what Austrian ancestry actually is began to come apart at the seams, not because it was false, but because it was never as simple as a single empire, a single bloodline, a single beginning. For generations, the accepted history felt almost self-evident. Austria sat at the heart of a dynasty, and the Habsburgs, one interpretation held, were not just rulers of the land, they were, in the popular imagination, its genetic anchor. Surnames tied to court titles, to imperial service, to old Alpine villages under Habsburg rule, were treated as proof of deep, continuous Austrian, even Germanic, ancestry stretching back through the centuries of the empire and beyond it, into some imagined pure Alpine past. Genealogists reinforce this by pointing to church registries, guild records, and noble rolls, all of which recorded names cleanly, generation after generation. If your family name appeared attached to a Tyrolean parish in the 1600s, the assumption followed naturally. Your ancestors had always been there, unchanged, untouched by the currents of the wider continent. It was a comforting story. It was also, historians now caution, built on documents that recorded names, not biology, and the empire those names served was never as ethnically uniform as its later mythology suggested. The first cracks did not come from a laboratory. They came from the paperwork itself. Researchers combing through Habsburg-era census and military records began noticing patterns that didn't fit the tidy story. Villages considered ethnically Austrian for centuries carried surnames with clear Slavic, Hungarian, Italian, and even Ottoman-adjacent linguistic roots, quietly Germanized over generations until they sounded indistinguishable from Old Austrian names. Family names assumed to be ancient Alpine lineages sometimes appeared, a few centuries earlier, in entirely different regions, Bohemia, Croatia, the Italian Tyrol, attached to people whose descendants would later think of themselves as unquestionably Austrian. Oral family histories added more friction. In parts of Carinthia and Styria, elderly relatives occasionally mentioned ancestors, from the east, or, from across the mountains, vague phrases historians long treated as folklore, until genealogists noticed the phrase kept surfacing in families with the most stereotypically Germanic-sounding surnames of all. Something was off, even before genetics entered the room. The Habsburg Empire had never been one people. It had been dozens of peoples, governed under one crown, and a surname, it turned out, could survive centuries of imperial administration while quietly erasing the ethnic complexity of the family carrying it. This is where DNA became the turning point, not to confirm the old story, but to test it against a record no bureaucracy could rewrite. Y chromosome DNA, passed largely unchanged from father to son, offered a way to trace direct paternal lines, the very lines that many Austrian surnames were meant to preserve. Mitochondrial DNA, inherited only from the mother, opened a second and independent channel, often revealing maternal ancestry that official records never bothered to note at all. Autosomal DNA, drawn from both parents across all generations, gave researchers something closer to a full ancestral portrait rather than a single narrow thread. Ancient and early modern DNA samples, recovered from Alpine burial sites and Habsburg-era cemeteries, made the comparison even sharper. For the first time, scientists could set the genomes of people who actually lived under the empire against the genomes of modern Austrians carrying the same surnames today. The old story was no longer facing assumption. It was facing evidence. If uncovering the layered ancestry behind a surname is the kind of story that grips you, consider subscribing, because almost every family name in Europe is hiding a history more complicated than its records admit. What the DNA revealed did not simply confirm centuries of Alpine continuity. It complicated it layer upon layer. The first surprise concerned diversity within Austria itself. Populations living under the Habsburg crown, including families whose surnames read as purely Germanic, carried significant ancestry linked to Slavic populations to the east, Hungarian and steppe-adjacent lineages from the Pannonian Plain, and, in some family lines, genetic signatures associated with the Italian peninsula and the Balkans. The empire, it turned out, had not simply ruled diverse peoples. It had, over centuries, quietly folded them into what would later be called Austrian ancestry. The second surprise ran deeper still. Some families with the most storied, court-linked surnames, names with genuine ties to Habsburg service, administration, or nobility, showed autosomal ancestry with only a modest connection to the historic Alpine core, while families with humble, obscure village names sometimes carried the deepest and most continuous Alpine genetic signatures of all. Prestige and imperial association, the evidence suggested, did not track cleanly with ancestral continuity. If anything, they sometimes ran in the opposite direction. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. There are, researchers suggest, several explanations that likely operate together, none canceling out the others. One possibility is large-scale imperial admixture. The Habsburg Empire, at its height, connected Vienna to Prague, Budapest, Milan, and the Adriatic coast, and administrative careers, military postings, and trade routes moved people, and their descendants, across those distances for centuries before any of it was recorded as migration. A second possibility involves what geneticists sometimes call a ghost population, ancestry that shows up clearly in the statistical data but does not map neatly onto any single well-documented historical group, hinting at older Alpine or Danubian populations that dissolved into later groups without leaving a distinct cultural label behind. A third possibility is cultural and linguistic absorption without full genetic replacement, meaning that becoming Austrian within the empire functioned in part like acquiring a civic identity. Language, religion, and administrative loyalty spreading through a population faster and further than ancestry ever did. Each explanation survives contact with the evidence. None fully accounts for all of it. And that, historians increasingly argue, may be the most honest description of Habsburg-era Austria available, not one bloodline radiating outward from Vienna, but many streams, converging under a single crown. The most decisive evidence came from a broader wave of ancient and historical DNA research across Central Europe in the past decade, comparing burial site genomes from Alpine and Danubian regions against large modern reference panels drawn from present-day Austria, Bavaria, Bohemia, and the former Habsburg lands. This was not a handful of isolated graves. It was one of the largest cross-regional comparisons of its kind, spanning centuries and multiple former imperial territories. The finding that mattered most was this: genetic ancestry associated with the historic Austrian core did not spread outward from a single origin point. It arrived from multiple directions in overlapping waves, over a period stretching back well before the Habsburgs ever took the throne. By the time the dynasty rose to power, the ancestral mixing that would define Austrian identity had, in crucial ways, already been underway for centuries. The twist was not that Austrian families carried some foreign ancestry mixed in at the margins. The twist was where, specifically, some of the deepest signals pointed, and how far back they reached. Certain families carrying textbook Old Austrian surnames trace paternal Y-DNA to haplogroups whose earliest concentrations sit not in the Alps at all, but farther east, tied to Bronze Age and Iron Age migrations that moved across the Pannonian Basin long before any empire existed to claim them. Meanwhile, maternal mitochondrial lines in some of the very same families point toward ancestry connected to the Italian peninsula and the Adriatic. Evidence, researchers suggest, of women who moved north through trade and marriage networks that predate the Habsburgs by hundreds of years. Not the ancestry these families expected. Not even the region they expected. The DNA was not erasing the Habsburg story. It was revealing an older, wider story running beneath it, one where Austrian was never a fixed starting point, but a convergence zone where far older migrations settled, mixed, and eventually forgot they had ever been anything else. Why does this matter beyond 15 surnames and one Alpine nation? because it reveals something true about nearly every population handed a tidy imperial or national origin story. Human history does not move in clean administrative lines, however neatly a crown or a census tries to draw them. People migrate, intermarry, get absorbed into new identities, and reappear generations later as an unremarkable entry in a parish register. A surname can preserve a name and a title. It cannot preserve a bloodline untouched by every empire, every road, and every marriage that name ever passed through. Austrian identity, the DNA suggests, was never a sealed Alpine vault. It was a long, layered negotiation between the people already living along the Danube and every group and empire ever pulled into its orbit. Slavic villagers, Hungarian nobles, Italian merchants, Bohemian craftsmen, and older Bronze Age populations whose names have been lost entirely. Picture, for a moment, the landscape that produced these names. Early autumn in the Alps, mist settling low over pine-covered slopes as the light turns amber over a valley. A village church bell carrying across terraced fields where 3 languages might have been spoken within living memory of any single family. A trade road threading down toward the Danube, carrying merchants, soldiers, and marriages in both directions for 1,000 years before anyone called the land by one name. Somewhere in that valley, a child is given a father's name, unaware that the name itself has already crossed borders, empires, and centuries just to reach her. That is the world where these 15 surnames took root. Not a fortress of unbroken Alpine purity, but a crossroads, a place where the wider continent kept arriving generation after generation, and quietly calling itself home. If your family carries one of these names, the DNA does not diminish that inheritance. It expands it. You are not descended from a single, uninterrupted Habsburg bloodline stretching back into legend. You are descended from something far larger and more improbable: Danubian farmers and Adriatic sailors, Slavic villagers and Alpine herders, 1,000 small unions across 1,000 years, all quietly funneling down into a name your family has carried, mostly unaware of everything that name was holding. The old story was not wrong because it was too proud. It was wrong because it was too small. The truth the genome preserves is stranger than the dynasty, a story of contact, absorption, and reinvention that no imperial record ever fully captured, because the people living it were too busy living it to write it down as evidence. The map of Central European ancestry is still being redrawn, sample by sample, genome by genome. And every surname on that map is a small, unfinished sentence in a story far older than any single crown. If stories like this fascinate you, let me know in the comments which name, or which empire, you'd like uncovered next.